going to introduce Toby Nixon. Toby Nixon is a lifetime LP member. He ran first as a Libertarian for state representative in Georgia in 1990. He received 6.9% in a three-way race. After relocating to Washington, he ran unsuccessfully in the 45th District for state representative in 2000 as a Republican. He was subsequently appointed to fill a legislative vacancy in 2001, and he was elected in 2002 and 2004. After a failed run for state senate in 2006, he led successful efforts to amend the King County Charter to make the Director of Elections a nonpartisan elected office and to annex the large area into Kirkland. He was also elected as a Fire District 41 Commissioner. In 2011, he was elected to the Kirkland City Council and re-elected without opposition in 2015. So join me and let's welcome Toby Nixon. Do you want a mic or can you?
Can you all hear me in the back without the microphone?
Yeah.
David might need it for the or do you?
I think you can pick it up just as well, right?
All right.
I'm a singer. I sing in multiple choirs, so I tend to have a pretty good voice. Well, I'm very happy to be here today and appreciate that kind introduction from Michelle. Of course, she just gave half my talk. But that's okay. I'm going to fill in some of the details. I first really got interested in politics and government in junior high school. So I'm going to go back pretty far. I had an excellent civics teacher who taught all of her students about the basics of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And everybody else thought it was torture, but I was the one who fell in love with it. And I've been involved in politics in some way ever since then, starting out in student government and then proceeding into real government, I suppose you could say. I first really got active in kind of party politics in 1980. I knew that I didn't like either Jimmy Carter or Ronald Reagan at the time, but I wanted to be involved in some way. And I actually ended up running the petitioning campaign to get John Anderson on the ballot in Florida. And at one time during that campaign, we were making phone calls at random, just trying to find anybody who would be willing to have us come over and have them sign a petition. And I rang up somebody who said they'd be happy to take my information on John Anderson if I would take some of their information about Ed Clark. How many of you remember Ed Clark, the Libertarian candidate for 1980? Well, that's what got me introduced to the Libertarian Party. This guy actually sent me a copy of the book Restoring the American Dream by Robert Ringer. Have any of you ever read this book? It is a great introduction to libertarian principles written for a mass market audience. So it's not quite as academic as some of the books that a lot of us read. That got me started. I actually left the Anderson campaign in the middle of October and said, I can't do this anymore. I'm a libertarian now. I'm going over here. But I was only 21 at the time. I was just getting started in a career. I didn't jump in to being active in the party until 1984, when my new wife and I moved to Atlanta. And literally the first week I was there, I rang up the Libertarian Party of Georgia and said, how can I help? And before I knew it, I was the state party secretary. Yeah. And I was on the board of Advocates for Self-Government. How many of you know about the Advocates for Self-Government? Now they promulgate this thing called the world's smallest political quiz. Some of you taken that?
Oh yeah.
Also known as the Nolan chart or the Diamond chart. I did the first electronic version of that, which we distributed on places like CompuServe and on bulletin board systems, right? And I got more and more into it. In 1988, I was actually Ron Paul's chauffeur, driving him around Atlanta when he came to Atlanta to speak at the state party convention that year. And I also, around that time, was when I became a life member of the Libertarian Party. Not a lifetime member, that makes it sound like since I was born. Oh. But a life member of the LP. And I don't even know if they still offer life memberships where you pay $1,000 all at once and you're a member forever. Maybe they do.
Yeah, it's like $1,500 now.
Is it $1,500 now? Yeah. So in 1990 was when I decided to run for public office the first time in the 61st House District in Georgia, in one of the suburban areas. And we made the decision that we were going to run a serious campaign to win. I actually still have the campaign plan for Nixon to State House campaign in 1990. And a huge amount of detail that we went into and how we were going to win, including a 10-page exposition on all the issues. I won't read them all to you, but it includes all the usual libertarian things like eliminating taxes and eliminating public schools and legalizing drugs and prostitution and all these wonderful principles. But we actually did pretty well. I mean, sometimes libertarians are just ignored in campaigns. But we got invited to all the newspaper editorial board interviews, all the public forums. We were in all the parades. We had signs. We had debates. We did a lot of doorbelling. Thousands of houses we doorbelled. We had sign waving, all these things. We even ran cable TV ads, and I think we were the first libertarian legislative campaign to ever run television ads on cable, local cable TV, which was relatively inexpensive. The internet didn't exist yet. There was no social media, so that was the things we did. And as Michelle mentioned, I got 6.9% of the vote in a three-way race, which at the time was the highest percentage any libertarian candidate in a state legislative race had ever received in a three-way race. So we were pretty proud of that, but we didn't win. In '92, I ran statewide in Georgia as labor commissioner. And Georgia is one of those states, kind of like Washington, where a lot of state offices are elected as opposed to being appointed by the governor. And I ran on a platform of eliminating a lot of business regulations, but mostly on the platform of eliminating the State Department of Labor. And we had really no money to speak of. But once again, we got invited to editorial board interviews all around the state. And it was a great learning experience to figure out what it's like to run a statewide campaign. We did get about 4% of the vote, a little over 4% of the vote. And but the interesting thing about that was that we held both the Democrat and the Republican to under 50%. And Georgia is one of those states where if nobody gets over 50%, you have a runoff, right, a few weeks after the general election. And both the Democrat and the Republican came to me and asked for my endorsement. And I deliberated on it for a little while. Then I endorsed the Republican, just because I agreed more with him than with the Democrat. And that Republican ended up being the first Republican to win election as labor commissioner since Reconstruction. So even though we didn't win, we had an influence on the outcome of the election, which I thought was a good thing. In '93, I moved here, lived in Kirkland, went to work for Microsoft. When we moved here, we had 5 kids under the age of 7. And my wife asked me if I would just kind of be a dad for a few years. And so I agreed. I mean, still was kind of involved in initiative campaigns and things like that. But it didn't last long. Michelle asked us, what was it that got us activated and wanted to participate? And for me, what got me out of the recliner, put down the remote, and get back to work was in 1995 and Safeco Field. I don't know how many of you were around back then, but they did a public vote on whether we should raise taxes to build Safeco Field. I worked on the no campaign because I feel very strongly that professional sports facilities should not be subsidized with tax dollars. And we won. The people voted it down. But then the legislature called a special session and passed it anyway.
Probably as an emergency.
As an emergency measure, so you couldn't put a referendum on it. Exactly. And that convinced me that something has to change in the Washington State Legislature. Now, I didn't immediately run for office, but what it did is say, okay, I'm going to start building the base that I need. And so for the next couple of years, I worked on other people's campaigns. I made the decision, well, I didn't actually make the decision. My wife forced me to make the decision. She said, if you're going to take time away from your family, you're not going to do it just to send a message. You're not going to do it just to get 7% of the vote again. You're going to do it to win. And in the 45th district at that time, that meant running as either a Democrat or a Republican. And so I decided to run as a Republican. I got involved in the party and still was openly libertarian philosophically. Never changed any of my positions on the issues, but decided to use the Republican Party infrastructure to get elected. I helped a few other people on campaigns, like for school board and for state representative in 1998, and those kind of things. And built a base amongst the PCOs of people who knew me and were willing to support me. They knew how I operated. And so when the opportunity came up in the year 2000, when there was not a Republican incumbent that I had to worry about, Laura Ruderman had gotten elected in 1998. First Democrat elected in the 45th district in like 2 decades. And the state legislature was tied. The state house was tied 49-49. Every race was critical. And so I ran against Ruderman in 2000. And it was the most money ever spent on a state house race up to that time. $600,000 was spent in that race, including the independent expenditures. I didn't win. Got 48-point-something%. But what I did do is make a name for myself. People knew who I was. And in 2001, I worked on Kathy Lambert's campaign to get her elected to the King County Council. She was in the other representative seat in the 45th district. And so when we were successful in getting her elected to the county council, I put myself forward to be appointed to fill the vacancy, and I was appointed. The PCOs made me their first choice. The King County Council selected me, and I went to Olympia as a state representative for the 2002 session. And then in 2002, in the fall, of course, I ran for the seat and had pretty good opposition. The person the Democrats put up against me was Dave Asher, who I now serve on the Kirkland City Council with. But Dave ran a serious campaign. I beat him pretty handily, though, by 6 or 7%. And in 2004, I just had token opposition. As Michelle said, I ran for the Senate in 2006 when Bill Finkbeiner decided not to run for re-election. And that was a terrible year to be running as a Republican. Y'all may remember that was, the Iraq War was a big deal. And my opponent, Eric Omig, didn't really even run a campaign against me. He ran against George Bush. And it worked. It made it very much a national campaign rather than a local campaign. And I lost, but I didn't just say, I'm done, be disappointed. As Michelle mentioned, in 2007, I decided that we needed to fix the problem in the King County Elections Office, where the county executive could pick the director of elections and have it be somebody under his control. We saw the result of that in the 2004 governor's race when King County basically handed the election to Christine Gregoire over Dino Rossi. But we said we have to change this. We need to make the director of elections a nonpartisan office, directly elected by the people, as it is in every other county in the state. And we were successful. It was an initiative to amend the King County Charter. And so that is now an elected nonpartisan office. 2008, I ran for the House seat again. 2008 was an even worse year to run as a Republican. That was the year Obama won office the first time. And every Democrat voted, even the dead ones, right? I mean, it was just, it was like 90% turnout statewide for that election, and it was a very difficult year. But again, I said I'm not done yet, and in 2009 I ran 2 things. I think you mentioned both of them. The area that I live in, which is Kingsgate in northeast Kirkland, and North Juanita and Finn Hill, were a big swath of unincorporated area in between Kirkland and Bothell. And we were effectively an urban area. The people who lived there expected urban level services, but we weren't getting that from King County. you know, if we called the police because we had somebody breaking into our car, it could take an hour to get a sheriff's deputy there. Because there was only ever 1 or 2 sheriff deputies on duty covering everything from Kenmore to Snoqualmie Pass. Right? It was crazy. And so annexation campaign, and that was successful. And that same year, I also ran for fire commissioner on the platform of shutting down the fire district. I've always had this dream of shutting down some part of the government, right? And I got elected, and because the annexation also succeeded, it meant that the fire district was going to be absorbed into the city and eliminated as a separate government agency. And so I spent the next year and a half as a fire commissioner figuring out how to smoothly shut down the fire district and turn all the assets over to the city. So it can be done. It is possible, just like we did with the Seattle Monorail project. It is possible to eliminate a government agency every now and then. And then in early 2011, the annexation was going to become effective June 1st of 2011. A lot of folks up in the area, Kingsgate, North Juanita, Finn Hill, came to me and said, "We need you to run for city council. We need somebody from this new part of the city to be on the council to defend our interests and to hold the city to its commitments that they made during the annexation campaign." And so I decided, yes, I would run. All the incumbents were running for re-election that year, though. There were no open seats. And so I had to pick an incumbent to run against. And the way I decided was, which of these incumbents who are up for election would I least like to serve with on the council if I won? And so I ran against one of them, Jessica Greenway, and I won by 192 votes out of about 20,000 cast. So it was very close. It was one of those elections where after the election's over, you're still working hard because you got to find out whose ballots have been rejected by the county because the signature didn't match or because they forgot to sign the envelope. And you're down there doing signature gathering, going back and getting signature affidavits from these people whose ballots have been rejected to make sure. And of course, you have to do a lot of vetting to make sure you're only actually asking the people you think would support you and not the other person. But we were successful in that, and even though a lot of ballots still came in after Election Day, we kept the margin. So, where am I in my long set of notes here? And as Michelle mentioned, in 2015, I was elected without opposition. I think every candidate should get to run without opposition at least once, don't you? No? Yes. Yeah. But I actually don't feel that way. I actually feel like contested elections are good for society. You have to have the issues debated, the current issues debated as much as possible. So I really don't think that we should have uncontested elections, but I was the beneficiary of it once, so I'm happy about that. So in my life, I don't know if anybody was keeping score. I run for office 9 times and won 5 times. So that's 56%. That's not too bad. Right. Wow. Right? And so you might wonder, well, what is my advice for how to win elections? And that was kind of what Michelle asked me to talk about, so I'll talk about that. I'm going to start off, I'm going to do it a little upside down. I'm going to talk about what I think is the most important point first. And the single most important factor that I can see in getting elected is how many people know you. And it's beyond just recognizing your name. It's how many actually know you as a person. And so it's very important to be known in the community. People need to know that, number one, you're a real, live, breathing human being, not just a name and a photo in a voter guide. They need to know that you actually care about the community. They have to have an idea of what you stand for. They have to know that you're civil, that you're able to work together in groups towards common goals. They have to know that you're smart, that you actually think through issues and don't just make snap judgments, that you're able to get things done. And the reason I say this is because the single most important factor in getting elected is the word of mouth. It's the people in the community talking to each other about you. You know, people all the time, and you see it all the time, they'll ask their friends, whether it's on Facebook or elsewhere, gosh, I don't know who to vote for in this race. Who should I vote for? And if somebody speaks up and says, oh, I know this Chris Moody guy. He's a good guy. You should vote for him. It makes all the difference in the world. Part of that is building a civic resume. And by that, I mean volunteering for things. And it can be really just about anything. It can be volunteering for service projects in the city, or at the food bank, or at the for the Little League. You know, there's lots of different things. I think back to Andy Hill, the former, recently deceased senator from the 45th district. His main claim to fame when he ran for state senate, I mean, right to one of the leading offices in the state, was that he had been the president of the Lake Washington Youth Soccer Association. Now, it just happens in that situation that there's like 8,000 families that participated in the Lake Washington Youth Soccer Association. They had seen that he accomplished important things in that role, and that was enough to win his election over Eric Omey in, what year would that have been, 2010. And there's a lot of opportunities to serve in this way. And if you can step it up, and you know, once you've been involved in an organization, volunteer to be on the board of the organization. You know, every nonprofit basically is looking for board members. It's not a lot of work. It's not a huge number of hours. You can also look at being appointed to city boards and commissions. Chris just interviewed to be appointed to the Kirkland Salary Commission. We just last night interviewed, gosh, it must have been 30 people for 15 or so openings on city boards and commissions. So whichever city you live in, they have those kind of things. And they exist at the county level as well. Get involved in your homeowners association, your neighborhood association, those kind of things. When I first ran for office, my key claim to fame in terms of community service was having been president of my neighborhood association for 10 years. And that was enough for people to see I had done something in and for the community. One observation I will make is that active participation in political parties does not seem to hold much credit to people. Because they kind of see that as being a separate thing from all the other things in the community. And many people actually view it as a negative, particularly if you're running for a nonpartisan office. To have been actively involved in partisan campaigning, those kind of things, can be a little bit of a negative. So my key point in all of this is that it's important to be prepared. I harken back to my Boy Scout days, and the Boy Scout motto is be prepared. There's a place for spontaneity. I don't think politics is one of those places. If you get out of the recliner and go down to the election office and pay your filing fee to run, and that's all you've ever done, you're not going to have a whole lot of credibility with voters, and probably won't be taken seriously. So once you start a campaign, what is the key? Well, the key is still getting to meet as many people as possible and have them get to know you. If you ask basically anybody involved in politics in the state, they're going to say doorbell, doorbell, doorbell. Going door to door, knocking on the doors, introducing yourself to people. The key point is not to debate them on the issues. You never want to get in a debate on somebody's doorstep over how you or they feel about a particular issue, except for maybe your 15-second elevator pitch on what you stand for. And sometimes they'll engage you in a conversation, but mostly it's just about meeting people face to face where they see that you're a real human being. But it goes beyond doorbelling, showing up at community meetings, going to the neighborhood picnics, going to the 4th of July celebrations, and all of those kind of things, and being as visible as possible. It never hurts to have a campaign volunteer standing beside you with one of your campaign signs, right? So that your name is going around, and people will gravitate to that if they happen to want to talk to you. So that works really well. It's important to get endorsements but endorsements from people who are also known in the community. It's one thing to have a list of a couple of hundred random names that nobody knows. It's another thing to have endorsements from business leaders, city council members, school board members, those kind of things. But they're not going to endorse you unless they know you first. So it's important to get involved in a way where they recognize you. And Michelle mentioned this, and I will emphasize it again. It's very important to have a positive message and stay on it. Now, I talked to you about what I had in my issues list in my 1990 campaign. I wouldn't do it exactly that way again. You want to have a message that is completely consistent with libertarian principles, but in a positive way. So let me, for example, tell you what my message has been in my two city council campaigns. Number one, I strongly believe in public safety and that we have to do an excellent job with protecting people in their homes through the police and the fire service. Number two is economic development. We need to be a community that welcomes business into our community by having low regulations so that we don't want to micromanage people's businesses. And third, I believe strongly in government transparency and accountability. People should know what their government is doing. They should never be surprised by anything the government does. Right? So there was 30 seconds, right? And it obviously worked for me. All of that is consistent with libertarian principles, but you're not talking about legalizing prostitution and drugs and eliminating taxes and eliminating public schools and privatizing all the highways. Everybody should have to pay a toll for every bit of a highway.
Bitcoin's a legal currency.
Obviously you want to stick to the jurisdiction that you're in and what's relevant to that jurisdiction too. But the point is that people will not vote for people who are proposing radical change. Michelle said it exactly right. They want to hear, or they're open to hearing about evolution, but not revolution.
Correct.
And we can talk about, armed insurrection and throwing out all the scoundrels and having a libertarian government tomorrow. People probably won't vote for that. But if you talk about positive change, the direction that you think it ought to go, you talk about individual liberty, personal responsibility, limited government, free markets, tolerance for other viewpoints, those kind of things. People, they do gravitate towards those kind of things because that's what they believe is right. How many of you ever heard the analogy of boiling a frog? Yeah, quite a few of you. It's just the idea that people will react and avoid any quick change, but if the change is very gradual, they will accept it. So we have to have patience, right? The statists have gotten us into the situation we're in very gradually, very incrementally, over centuries. Now, hopefully we won't take centuries to undo it, but to think that we're going to undo it in one term of office, it's just not going to happen. And so our goal needs to be to get into office so that we can begin to have an influence, to bend the curve, to slow the growth of the size and scope of government, and then slowly to begin to reverse it. And then over time, be able to actively move it in the direction of a more free society. So, just a couple of other practical things. Number one, I'm not going to go into all the details of how to win a local election. Go to Amazon, search books for how to win a local election. And there are several the first few that pop up are all excellent books. I have most of them. And they have excellent step-by-step instructions of the things you need to do to win elections at the local level. And in many cases, the same things at the state level. I think the key thing that we do in elections in Washington State is you have to have a killer voter guide statement. Because for so many voters, that's the only thing they ever look at. The direct mail stuff they get just goes in the trash. right? A lot of people aren't watching TV anymore, so even if you do get ads on cable TV, they're skipping them with the TiVo, right? Or they're just watching Netflix or something, and they're just not seeing your ads, and they're a lot more expensive now than they were back in 1990. The other thing I would suggest that you do is do opposition research, not only on your opponent, but on yourself. You should do a full search on your own name, because you need to be able to be prepared. There's that Scout motto again. To be prepared to respond to whatever they come up with. And so you may find that, well, I'll go back to my 2000 campaign against Laura Rudiman. Laura Rudiman scrounged through the archives of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and found letters to the editor I had written back in 1988 and 1989, etc., about we don't want any stinking buses in our counties, right? I was very, very vocal about opposing mass transit. And a few other things that she brought up. And I wasn't prepared, because I hadn't thought about, really, she's going to go look at letters to the editor I wrote more than a decade ago and quote those in our current campaign, but she did. So you should know yourself what they're going to find. But also know those things about your opponent, because every now and then, it doesn't always happen, every now and then you'll find a situation where they did something legally questionable and that might be disqualifying for them to serve in office. Of course, today, I didn't have this in 1990 when I first ran, but social media is key. Having a good website, having a good Facebook presence, all of those things, of course. And keeping them live, keeping them updated. And then having a lot of people writing positive letters to the editor for you is a real good thing. People do read the letters to the editor. I, these days, would not spend a lot of money on direct mail. As I mentioned before, people tend to just throw it away. And yet, if you work with a professional political consultant, they're going to want you to pump a lot of money into direct mail, because they get a kickback from the printing company, right? And they get a percentage of everything you spend money on. And that's the single most, other than TV ads, that's the single most expensive thing that you would do in a campaign. I will tell you that the thing that we did in my 2011 campaign for city council that I think was most effective in us winning the election was newspaper ads. You'll say, newspaper ads? That's so 2 centuries ago. But the newspapers around here are very focused. It's the Kirkland Reporter. Only people in Kirkland get it, which means you're only paying for the eyeballs of people in Kirkland. And most of the other cities around here have the same sort of thing. What we did is we ran 8.5 by 11 two-sided printed inserts that got blown into the paper along with the coupons. You say, well, people are just going to throw those out with the coupons. But no, what we did is we ran a little tiny ad inside the paper which said, look for our insert in the paper. So the inserts are way cheaper than display ads inside the paper. To run an ad this big inside the paper would be $10,000. To put a sheet of paper this big as an insert in the paper cost about $1,000. And then the little ad is only a couple hundred. And that's a way to get a lot of information to people. You know, everybody reads these local papers because they're full of positive news and what's going on in the city, and they're free. And so, anyway, that's my advice to you, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Any questions?
What tools would you suggest for self-research, other than just searching on social media?
So in addition to like Bing, or I have to say Bing because I work at Microsoft, Bing or Google, just looking for the person's name, look at public records. So if let's say somebody is running in Kirkland, I would do a public record search in Kirkland to find things that have your name or your opponent's name in it. I would do that with King County. And I would look at property records too. What kind of property transactions do they engage in? Do they have any bankruptcies, or do they have any, you know, those kind of things? And then the other thing would be to look at the newspaper archives. What letters to the editor have they written? Or how have they been in the news? And you know, the Seattle Times and the Reporter newspapers, they all have good archives. Those are the key things I've looked at. Oh, one more thing. Look at the PDC. You can go to the Public Disclosure Commission and you can see who have they made contributions to in the past. And that can tell you something about where they stand politically. Yes?
How do you gauge the community on issues and like figure out which is the most important issue to start with?
Talk to people.
So I didn't really do this in 2015 because I was unopposed. But in 2011, we actually did some polling. And you can do automated telephone polling pretty inexpensively. And so we used that to kind of prioritize what the issues were people were concerned about in the community. I mean, there are certainly other ways to do it, like you can do your own telephone poll. Just start calling phone numbers at random and say, hi, I'm taking a poll on public issues. And people will surprisingly talk about it, but do a good job of making it sound like you're a real independent pollster.
So would you say that if you're involved in doorbelling, that having such items as window slicks, bumper stickers, and yard signs, that's really the moment to grab somebody's commitment to you, isn't it?
Well, certainly, whenever I've doorbelled, I've always had signs in my trunk. I don't carry them around with me.
Right.
And I always have one of those cards that's about that size. You know, have a pocket full of them. And so you always want to leave them with somebody if they answer the door. My experience is not everybody answers the door. There's a lot of people who aren't home. But then you can write a note on it and say, sorry, I missed you. Call me if you have any questions. And leave that on their doorstep. And if they have really pretty flowers in a basket next to the front door, say, love your flowers, right? Yeah.
Right.
Yes?
Is there anything you can think about that was like one of the most difficult situations that you guys had to overcome, and what did you find to overcome it?
Oh my goodness. I have to think through the different campaigns. So I think the most difficult time I ever had in a campaign was in the 2006 campaign when I was running for the state senate with Eric Omig. And like I said, he ran a national campaign. He was running against George Bush. But all the people who were supporting him, the independent expenditures from the labor unions, and especially the teachers union, they were very negative against me, and they were all lies. Of course, every candidate says it's a lie, but these really were lies. Just one example, they had a piece that showed a glass of dirty water and something about Toby Nixon doesn't care about water pollution. And then they had the asterisk that says, pointed to a bill that I had voted on. And this is probably more detailed than you wanted, but that bill was about whether inspections of septic tanks should be done by the local health department of the county, or they should be all moved up to the state level and create a new state agency to be responsible for inspecting septic tanks. Right? These are the exciting things you work on in the legislature, right? And I said, I don't want to create no new state agency to inspect septic tanks throughout the state, so I voted no. And of course, they turned that into, and the bill was actually about keeping Puget Sound clean, right? Because they were concerned that runoff from failing septic fields was getting into Puget Sound and polluting the sound. Well, we don't drink Puget Sound water. So what's this glass of dirty water about? Anyway, yeah. So it was hard to not just go into a flaming rage over the lies that were being told. But that's part of campaigning. Once you are a serious threat to the establishment, they're going to attack you that way. And of course, when you're an incumbent and you've taken a few hundred votes on issues, there's a bigger surface area for attack. But you can bet that will be one of the hardest things you deal with, is the negative attacks from the other side.
Well, thanks.
Sure.
Really appreciate you coming out. And
Yes.